All right. Let me know if that phone is.
Do my best.
Well, if it suddenly turns off. Okay. So sorry, just talking to these guys. Back. Recap. So recapping just the Italian school real quick to see if you had any questions about them before we move forward. So Pythagoras, we all remember Pythagoras, spent more time talking about him than anyone. He thought everything was composed of numbers. And then these three basically just follow Parmenides. What do you remember about Parmenides?
He was the strictly monist.
Yeah, everything's composed of just one stuff. The one stuff. Thought about this universe as this timeless being, a plenum of one stuff, undifferentiated mass, just sitting there, never changing, never moving. And any motion, change that we think we experience, it's all just an illusion. Zeno is the one that gave a bunch of arguments supporting Parmenides' position. Melissus differs from Parmenides only in a couple points. One, he thought that the universe was eternal, as in how we think about eternal. It's like a god is eternal, never dies. They exist for an infinite amount of time. Remember, Parmenides thought it's a timeless being. The notion of time doesn't really make sense. Melissus says, no, it's existing infinitely long. He also thought about the universe as infinite in size. Parmenides had a more Pythagorean view where it was limited in size. And then one more place where Melissus differed from Parmenides is he thought of it as incorporeal, not real, not physical, which was quite a leap to get to there. You might remember his argument for that. Since the constituent parts of the universe have no size, no body, then it must all be incorporeal, no physical being. Any questions about any of those before we move on? All right. So today, then, we'll be talking about the Greco-Persian Wars. We'll be going into decent depth with these wars, but these will be the only wars that we give such depth to. A couple reasons for that. One, these are probably the most important wars when it comes to Western civilization's history. And two, it does, the narrative of the war does a great job capturing the Greek psyche, which helps make their philosophy appeal to our intuition more and make more sense to us. So, keeping up with politically what's going on, but on top of that, it will help give us insight into some of the philosophical positions that we'll talk about as time goes on. So, talk about the war now. Setting up the war. You might remember this map from way back. Going way back when we were talking about the kingdom of Lydia. And remember, all those Ionian cities we were talking about were on the coast of Lydia. This is where the war is going to start with, is with these cities like Miletus that we've been talking about. So, back when Lydia was still on the map, remember they had a deal with these Ionian cities that they can manage their internal affairs however they want, as long as they assist Lydia with external affairs. So it was a very soft government for these cities, these Ionian cities in Lydia. Now down here, Cyrus the Great is a prince down here. He's not the one in control of the Median Empire, he's just a prince in this area. He ends up overthrowing the Median Empire, establishing the Persian Empire. Lydia sees that as a great opportunity to expand their political influence. If the Median Empire is undergoing a revolution, this is a great time for Lydia to go on the offensive and get some more land. Now we know that Cyrus the Great ends up conquering. He comes across, he's not happy at Lydia for encroaching on what he's going to call his territory, so he ends up going to war with Lydia. Ultimately, he wins the war with Lydia. Now, while the Persians were conquering Lydia, they asked the Ionian cities here to revolt, and the Ionian cities refused to revolt. They assisted Lydia against the Persians. So the Persians wanted the Ionian cities to help them fight Lydia. The Ionian cities refused. Cyrus the Great ends up winning the war, so now all those cities come under Cyrus the Great. So these cities, once Cyrus the Great takes over, they say, we'll do the same deal with you that we can jump forward on the map here, so he ends up conquering it, and the Persian Empire expands like that. Anyways, when he conquers the cities here, these Ionian cities, they say, we'll make the same deal with you that we made with Lydia. We'll help you with all external affairs if you let us manage our own affairs internally. And Cyrus says, no, it's too late for that. So he comes down on them relatively hard compared to how he comes down on other people. Now, these Ionian cities are notoriously difficult to govern. It's not like Egypt down here. When Cyrus, well, it wasn't Cyrus that conquered Egypt, but when Egypt gets conquered, all you have to do is get the Pharaoh to fall in line, and all of Egypt falls in line. So once you got one man in control, there's internal structure already that you can utilize to control the whole area. Similar thing when they conquered Jerusalem over here. Once you got the priests in line, all the Jews followed. So there's internal structures all over the place that he could utilize to help keep the people in that local region well governed and under control. The problem with these Ionian city-states is, not city-states, these Ionian cities is, there is no internal structure like that. Internally, they are very politically competitive. At one point, one family's in power, at the next another. It's very, very competitive. There isn't this internal structure. Furthermore, once you get one city well managed, that does nothing to help you with the next city. Miletus could care less what's going on with Samos when it comes to their politics. So all these cities are very difficult to govern, and so the Persians have to figure out how they're going to handle the situation. And so what they end up doing is putting tyrants in power in each of these cities. So they find someone in the city who's already pretty high up, and then they just give him all the political power in the city, but he comes under the Persian king.
So the Persians did that?
Yes. So the Persians go to the city, pick a man who's already powerful in the city to become the tyrant, and now he is the one that has all control inside that city. These cities would have had their own little mini armies. They would have had their own little mini fleets. So the tyrant should have everything locally that he needs to just manage the power, but he's ruling very much with an iron fist now, which these cities absolutely resent. The people in the city absolutely resent these tyrants. So it's the tyrants in these cities that are ultimately a lot of friction between the tyrants and the people that they're ruling, and it's kind of like a keg of gunpowder here, like anything could set them off at any moment.
So these Ionian cities are a lot like countries, like independent countries.
Yes.
In the way that they operate.
They viewed themselves as basically independent city-states, with the exception that they all need to support Lydia. So even though they were all supporting Lydia, they were still in competition with each other. It's just in external affairs they support Lydia. So yeah, very much their own political entities is how they've always viewed themselves. And now that's very much being taken away from them. They're being told, nope, you are Persians, you come under the Persian way of doing things. Don't need any of that, we'll just keep with maps. Okay, so now we're zooming up on the Greek peninsula here. And now we've got, in these Ionian cities over here, we have tyrants in power. Now the tyrants, they have their own little military, they have their own little mini fleet, and in particular we're going to talk about the tyrant at Miletus. Now Miletus is like the most powerful of the Ionian cities on the coast. The two big shots are Miletus and Samos. Samos is on an island. These are the two big shots, and it's kind of understood that Miletus is like, even though they're not politically united, he's like the big brother of the Ionian cities along the shore here. Well, the tyrant at Miletus, one more thing to mention with how the Persians govern. So the Persians, they have their empire split up into separate provinces, kind of like America split up into states. And then there's a governor that's at the head of each province. They call it a satrap. So Sardis is the capital of like the Lydia province now. The same way that Salt Lake City is the capital of Utah. Sardis is the capital of just the Lydia province inside the Persian Empire. And so the governor of the satrap is located at Sardis. So that's who these tyrants basically fall under, is the satrap here at Sardis. With me so far?
Isn't that how the Romans operated too, pretty much?
Yes.
Conquered people?
One massive difference is, so what the Persians did to maintain power. First off, the Persian king, he appoints both the satrap, and then he also appoints the head of the military in that region. So he actually splits those powers in two, and both of them answer directly to him. That way someone can't get power in the region. But yeah, very similar. Anyways, so they fall under him. So you have the tyrant at Miletus, and he has this plan to extend his political influence. He wants to capture this island down here, Naxos, which also has a city on it by the same name. So he wants to capture this and bring it under his rule as well. So he goes to the local satrap and he says, hey, is it okay if I use my army and I go do this? And he gets the green light to go ahead, so that's what he does. So he goes over, tries to take Naxos, and he gets destroyed. It's just a huge blunder. And now he's in a pickle as he's coming back to Miletus, wondering what he's going to do, because he's in trouble. His idea was a complete failure. It didn't go how he said it was going to go. He knows at the very least he's going to lose his position as tyrant, possibly his life. Well, here he is. He's in control of the big brother of the Ionian cities. So instead what he decides to do is start a revolt and start convincing all the Ionian cities to start revolting against the Lydian province. Revolting against the Persian Empire, essentially. So he's the one that actually kicks off this revolt. So tries to conquer Naxos, that doesn't work. Says, okay, let's all become Greek again and conquer these guys, or fight these guys instead. And it works. Like I said, these guys were just looking for an excuse. And once Miletus is the one heading it up, everyone else is ready to fall in line. And so a big revolt breaks out. These Ionian cities all start overthrowing their tyrants and they start establishing democracies. Now, why democracies? Athens, prior to this revolt, but just prior to it, had just overthrown a tyrant and established a democracy there. And while Miletus is viewed as the big brother of these guys, Athens is viewed as the big brother of this whole area over here. And so they all kind of fall in line with whatever Athens is doing. Remember, a lot of these were originally just Athenian colonies. This is where they're ethnically from. So Athens has a democracy. Now these guys started a revolution and they all established democracies. And no doubt part of their reason for establishing democracies is try to elicit support from the Greeks. They know that by themselves they're not going to be able to take on the Persian Empire. So once the revolt starts, the first thing they do is they go to the Greeks and start asking for help. Now on mainland Greece, it's completely understood who the big kid on the block is, not Sparta, so that's who they go to first and foremost. But Sparta, they have a bunch of slaves over here called the Helots. They don't dare take their army too far away, so they're very conservative, like to keep their army here. They say, nope, you're on your own. Athens, on the other hand, is more sympathetic to him, and Eretria is more sympathetic to him. So Athens and Eretria actually give them military support for this revolt. So
So in effect, this tyrant in Miletus was able to unite the Greeks with the Ionian cities and
he triggered the thing that.
on the Persian Empire. Wow.
Yep. He kind of triggered the inevitable. It's often related to the start of World War I. Once the right trigger comes along, everyone knows it's just a matter of time.
Mm-hmm.
So these guys were ready to revolt. Once Miletus started it, everyone's like, yep, this is what we've been waiting for. Let's go. So yeah, Athens and Eretria, they give military support to this Ionian revolt. And the Ionian revolt is very successful. They go, they capture the capital city of this local area, Sardis, and they burn it to the ground. Well, by that time, the Persians have mobilized, and now they're able to start fighting him back. It's kind of a back and forth until finally the Battle of Lade here, where the Persians win. So what ends up happening is, remember Miletus and Samos, they're always competing against each other. Since the Persians came to power, I need to point something out up here. Since the Persians came to power, they have that city right there, Byzantine, which cuts off all access to the Black Sea up here. A large part of Samos and Miletus' trade and a large part of what made them such wealthy cities was trade up here. Since the Persians took over, one of the things they did is cut them off from that trade, which is economically handicapping these cities. So Persia comes to Samos and says, Samos, if you will betray the revolt here, and you'll join us, then one, we'll forgive you of all your past wrongs, which means now you can internally start managing yourself how you want. But on top of that, we'll give you preferred access to what's up here. So now your city's guaranteed to become super wealthy. And so Samos, they decide to do that. Now Samos is a very powerful city here. I think they had a fleet of 60 ships. Altogether, these guys would have put together a fleet of 200 to 300 ships. And like 60 of those would have been just Samos alone. So in this big battle that's about to happen here, right before the battle starts, the 60 ships that belong to Samos switch sides. And that's enough to defeat the morale of the Ionians. And they just are like, oh no, we're in trouble, and so they try sailing away. And with early wars, that's when all the casualties happen. So early wars is pretty much two armies meet head-to-head fighting. Most of the deaths don't happen when they're fighting head-to-head. It's when one army thinks loss is inevitable and turns around and starts running. That's when all the casualties happen. That's when they get destroyed. So with these early wars, the name of the game is get the other army to retreat. You'll notice this with a great general doing this was Alexander the Great. It's one of the reasons he was so successful. What he did is he had an elite team of cavalry, and in the war, whenever he came against a Persian king, he'd take his cavalry and charge right at the Persian king. Persian king would panic, run off the battlefield. All the soldiers see, oh no, our king just left, that must mean we're doomed. So they just start running off the battlefield, and so a battle that the Persians could have easily won becomes an absolute slaughter and a huge victory for the Greeks. And that happens over and over again. So that's the name of the game with these early battles, is try to destroy the morale of your opponent so that they'll try and retreat. And then that's when you get your real victory. So anyways, as soon as they see those ships switch sides, that completely destroys them. They're like, oh no, we're in for it. They panic, they scatter, and they get destroyed. And that puts an end to the revolt. And Miletus, as the one leading it, and for burning Sardis to the ground, gets itself burnt to the ground, and the entire population sold into slavery. And that ends the revolt. Now the Persian king is still very upset with the Greeks over here for supporting this revolt, namely Athens and Eretria. And he decides that he is going to get his revenge on these two. Now, the revolt over here, it took about 5 years for it to all come to an end. So there was 5 years of this revolt going on, to give you a rough timeline of how long that went on. Finally coming to a close around 494 BC. And so Persian king gets together an army, takes him about 2 years to do that, to come and invade. Now during the Ionian Revolt, Thrace, which is right here, and Macedonia also got their independence for a second. So first thing the Persian king wants to do, Darius wants to do, is recapture those and then come into Greece this way. So with his first invasion army, that's the big plan. So that's this green line here. This arrow is what the fleet did, and then this is the land army from where they started. So they cross the Hellespont, come up through here, and they conquer it, and they're able to retake Macedonia. Now their fleet, which is following this line, they're coming along, and somewhere around here, they hit a massive storm, which destroys a good portion of the fleet. So the fleet can no longer provide support to the main army. So the invasion into Greece is postponed. So that was the first invasion in 1992. Due to some bad weather, it ends up not really going anywhere. So it's the second invasion army that actually gets to Greece and starts to do some damage. So we'll let Jeremy start there, and then I'll pick it up from there again.
What was the name of the Persian king at the time?
This is Darius the First.
Darius?
Yep. Also known as Darius the Great. At least in the Persian Empire. Okay. The Greco-Persian Wars, also known simply as the Persian Wars, are a series of epic battles between the ambitious Persian Empire and the reputable Greek city-states. It consists of 4 major battles: Marathon, Thermopylae, Salamis, and Plataea, all of which become legendary. It began when Persian King Darius I, or Darius the Great. His empire was growing rapidly, taking over Lydia and the Ionian territories, as well as many others, including Egypt. Rapidly increasing, the Persian Empire was the strongest in all the known world at that time. They had the largest army, greatest navy, and war expertise. After King Darius took the Ionian Greek city-states, then those states had a revolt against the Persian rule, which was what Donnie described. So I'll skip that part. He eventually gets mad at Athens, wants to get revenge on him, and starts gathering his army and cavalry and his navy to go against the Greeks and take them over and invade them, known as the Greco-Persian Wars. He gathers his troops onto ships and sends them across the Aegean Sea to begin the invasion of Greece. His fleet quickly overtook the Greeks' island Euboea and a few others on the way. He sends envoys to Athens to let them know that they can surrender or perish fighting. The Greeks, being who they were, executed the envoys. This enraged Darius, and he moved his army onto the mainland, introducing the Battle of Marathon. Athens gathered together its army to meet these invading Persians, and they sent Pheidippides to request assistance from their sister city-state, Sparta. He made the run in 2 days, and Sparta told him that they were in the middle of a religious holiday, and that they could not leave or might enrage their gods. So Athens had to stop the Persians alone. He ran back to Marathon to tell them that, and from his run, we got the traditional use of the word marathon in the famous race of the marathon. Athens was able to muster together around 10,000 to 20,000 army to protect Athens against the 90,000 strong army of the Persians, who also had a cavalry. While many things looked bleak, the Greeks knew their land and were able to set up a strategic defense position so that they'd be able to hold off the great Persian army until the Spartans were able to come and assist them. The Persians knew this, and they didn't want to walk in the trap, so they waited for the Greeks to make their move. They waited 2 days until Darius's leading general decided it wasn't worth it to walk into the trap, and began to load his army onto his ships to get to Athens at a different angle. He began by loading the cavalry on first, but this proved to be his fatal mistake. With their backs turned and their cavalry loaded on the boats, the Greek commander Miltiades ordered the attack. Their heavily armored hoplites were able to group into phalanxes, which is basically the wall of bronze, where you get the bronze shields and you get the spears on there. That's basically the Greeks' most strategic maneuver that they were able to use during these battles. And 3 groups of phalanxes were able to attack the Persians as they ran onto the boat. The Persians had no way to deal with this maneuver. They had their archers in the front because their cavalry were already loaded, and they were going to load the archers on last. And since it's a close-up combat, they didn't even know what to do. Needless to say, they were massacred. 6,400 Persians were killed, and only 192 Greeks. Their survivors hurried on their boats and quickly sailed for another vantage point of Athens. Once again, Pheidippides ran to Athens to tell them that the battle was won, and the Persians were on their way. Then he died of exhaustion. The Athenian army, despite just coming from battle, also hurried to Athens to protect it, and arrived just before the Persians were able to get there. You can imagine the surprise of the Persians when they come to Athens and see the army that just massacred them on the shore, waiting for them to drop anchor. However, King Darius wasn't going to do this, and he went back to Persia, either out of fright or to reassemble his army, or because he was just too old. And thus the Battle of Marathon quickly became legendary and marked an incredible victory for the Greeks. It's basically what told them, hey, maybe we can beat these Persians. The next battle, Thermopylae, perhaps the most renowned of all the battles, also known as the Battle of the 300, was to come later. Darius the Great died, and his son, Xerxes, ascended to the throne. He did not appreciate the fool they made of the Persian Empire those years ago, and was determined to succeed where his father had failed. The Greeks, however, also had time to prepare. The general Themistocles convinced the Athenians to begin construction on triremes, a battleship with 3 sets of rows and a ram at the head. The Athenians, Spartans, and other less prominent city-states met at Corinth to devise a strategy against the coming Persian army. Xerxes took his army across the Aegean Sea with the intent of taking Athens, but this time he wanted to go through Thrace. In order to reach Athens, however, he was forced to go through a mountain pass, which was called Thermopylae. Lucky for him, the battle once again lined with a Spartan holiday. The Spartans consented to send a hoplite army of only 300 troops, led by the famed General Leonidas, to hold off the Persians. The amount of Greeks assembled to fight consists of about 2,000 to 4,000 men, with only 300 Spartans. This was met with a 150,000 man army of the Persians, and so began the famed Battle of Thermopylae. Using the pass to the advantage of the incredibly skilled Greeks, they only needed to buy time for the Athenians to evacuate the city, as there was little hope of stopping this incredible force of the Persians. They also used the time to build their warships to prepare for future battles against the Persians. Leonidas knew he needed to stop the Persians, and knew he would die trying. The Persians sent archers and their elite troops, known as the Immortals, at them, and the Greeks kept fighting. A day goes by, and they still fight, massacring the Persians and losing very little of themselves. Another day goes by, and still they fight. Xerxes sends the best troops he has at them, the greatest his army had to offer, and still Leonidas held the pass against the swarming numbers. Nothing could stop them. Nothing, however, except themselves. There was a traitor in the Greek army named Phalanx, He showed the Persians a way around the pass to flank the indestructible army. It would soon collapse under the weight of the Persians attacking on both sides. The Persians sent a commander to ask the Greeks to surrender. Leonidas' response was never. To utter dismay, the Persians pointed toward his still massive army and then at the sun and says, "If you do not surrender, we will loose arrows in such great quantity that they will black out the sun." To this Leonidas responds with, "Then we will fight in the shade." The Persian army then used the traitorous Ephialtes' path to flank the Spartans. Yet still they fight with every fiber of their being. However, fighting the Persians on both sides proved too much for these legendary heroes, who had already undergone such incredible strains to hold this massive army for as many days as they did. They were killed down to the last man. However, they did not die in vain, and when the Persian army finally broke through, they found Athens a ghost town, not a soul left stirring to greet them. Xerxes then burned and pillaged what was left, and while he accomplished what he came for, he was left unsatisfied. He gathered the survivors of his army onto his ships and went to Salamis, where he would destroy those infuriating Greeks. While the great commander Themistocles was able to create many warships, he was still terribly outnumbered by the Persian navy, his army of 300 to fight the 500. He had to use his triremes, a battleship with 3 oars and a ram, to win out the Persian ships, which they also included their own triremes, some of them even bigger than the Athenians. However, he was a militant genius. As the Persians were nearing Salamis, he used miscommunication to his advantage and sent a spy Greek to the Persian army. The spy would tell them that the Greeks would feign a retreat and attack the Persians when they pursued. They would hide behind the island and attack them as they came through. Xerxes, knowing this and having more naval superiority than the Greeks, felt confident. He set a chair on a mountaintop overlooking the battle and awaited his army to destroy the Greeks. Except he didn't know what Themistocles had up his sleeve. The Greeks had asked the great oracle of Apollo at Delphi to guide them as to what they must do to win these Persians. The response they got was, "Only one wall will keep you safe." While there were many interpretations, it was Themistocles who pointed out that they had a wooden navy and it was their best chance at stopping the invaders. When the Greek traitor led them to the Greek fleet, the Greeks began their retreat just as the Persians had been told, the fake retreat. However, instead of hiding behind the island like was said, they hid in the Gulf of Salamis. When the Persians came through the strait and were expecting to turn to catch them off guard, that's when the Greeks hit them with everything they could muster. The 3 rows of oars gave them incredible speed, and the reinforced ram gave them the power necessary to drive through the enemy ranks. They destroyed the Persians, and only a few were able to retreat. This fulfilled the oracle of Delphi and secured Greeks over the nearby seas. It is told that Xerxes wept as he watched his prized navy foiled once again by those Greeks. While Themistocles had won them a great naval battle, the largest battle was still looming over the horizon, setting its sights on all of Greece, and determined to win this band of city-states. The Persian king Xerxes then sailed home to his palace at Persia, but he was not abandoning the war. He left the most gifted of all his generals, Mardonius, to quench the pitiable Greek defenders. The Persians may have lost the naval battle, but they still had burned Athens and controlled much of Greece, and they had a massive land army. In order to survive the coming assault, the Greeks gathered the largest army of Hoplites possible from over 30 city-states in what would be the greatest of all the battles, which would determine whether the Greek stands or falls against these Persian invaders. Their art, religion, culture, and very way of life was at risk. There was only glorious victory or terrible defeat. The Greek army they mustered was around 110,000 troops, and while the exact number of the Persians cannot be agreed upon, it's clear they outnumbered the Greeks once again. These 2 armies met at Plataea in 497 BC, and thus began the greatest of all the terrible battles in the devastating Greco-Persian Wars. The Greeks once again employed the use of the Hoplite phalanxes, or bronze shields that were devastating to the Persians. Their rain of arrows could not pierce the ranks of heavily armored Spartan warriors, and while the Persians did great damage to the Greeks, the city-states of Greece claimed victory over the ambitious Persians. They were chased off Greece, and their role was taken from the Greek islands. Invigorated by this seemingly impossible feat, the Greeks continued to spread their influence and free their sister city-states in Ionia. they would go through and keep pushing the Persians back since the Persians couldn't even stop them. And they just went through and pushed them and pushed them and pushed them farther than Ionia. They took back what was previously theirs. Xerxes' ambition for the Greek islands was dissolved, and he faced more pressing issues within his empire. The Greeks had defeated the invaders. They had prevailed against the strongest army in the world. The Greco-Persian Wars were a critical part of history. If the Persians had prevailed, we would not have the Greek influence that we do now. Their art, philosophy, theology, and culture would have been lost. The Western world as we know it would have been completely different. But because of the infamous Greeks, such as Miltiades, Philippides, Leonidas, Themistocles, and many others who said, "We can and we will," we still have the impact Greece left on the world. For Greece, however, the victory not only guaranteed her freedom from foreign rule, but also permitted, soon after, an astonishingly rich period of artistic and cultural endeavor, which would lay the cultural foundations of all future Western civilizations. Those are the Greco-Persian Wars.
Wonderful, thanks.
What was Alexander's purpose in going east?
To conquer.
Just to do it?
That's where civilization was. Rome is a little backwood nobody at this time.
So there's
The
nothing
most prominent
west.
people on the Italian peninsula are the Greek colonies there. Maybe the Etruscans. I mean, just nobodies. Everything to conquer is to the east. Let's see. Okay, so pick up back again with the second invasion. And start with this earth and water thing that the Persians wanted, because this is where you start to capture this Greek psychology. So after this first invasion goes south, Darius, before he launches the second invasion, he sends these embassies to Athens and Sparta. Athens and Sparta are the two uniting against him. Understand, it is not Greece united against the Persian Empire. It's 30 city-states loosely united against the Persian Empire. Some of them are pro-Persia. Some of them are completely neutral. So this isn't everyone united against those guys. It's a few causing some problems. In particular, there's those that always follow Sparta because he's the big boy on the block. And then Athens has a pretty good following over here. So it's Athens and Sparta that are really causing a problem for him. So after this goes south, Darius is thinking, all right, I'll make this offer once again, give him a chance to just give me earth and water, and we'll be in our merry way. Now here's all Darius wants this is all the Persians wanted from their subjects. You would give the king earth and water. This was a sign of subjecting yourself to him. I mean, it's equivalent to like prostrating yourself before him, bowing down to him, recognizing he is the king over you. And then outside of that, you have a light tax load compared to how things had been prior to that. And then you have to contribute troops to military ventures. It is not very extreme at all. But the Greeks would never do this. The reason that they would not do it is the idea of free men subjugating themselves to some king was out of the question. That's why. They wouldn't do it. So it was a really simple thing. Just give me earth and water, recognize I'm a king. Just bow down to me, and then I won't punch you in the face, basically. It's a really simple thing to do. They say such an act is beneath the dignity of a free man. And if it costs me my life, so be it. I'm not going to bow to you. That was the attitude of these Greeks towards these Persians. Very frustrating for the Persians, because relative to what they knew, they are so nice and loving and kind compared to the Babylonians and the Assyrians and the Medians. And yet, this simple request, the Greeks are absolutely refusing. And that is why they will not recognize someone as their king. They are a free man, they're a slave to no one. So they viewed Persians telling them, look, just be our slaves. Your life will be really nice. We'll be really kind to you, but just be our slaves. They're saying no. That's out of the question. So that's what this earth and water, offering earth and water to the king is supposed to be. And so Darius, before he launches the second invasion, he sends embassies to Athens and Sparta asking for earth and water, giving them a second chance before he brings his army in. Athens, they flat out throw the emissary off a cliff. Sparta was a little cute about it. They took the embassy and they kicked him into a well. They says, if you want earth and water for your king, it's down there. So, kicked him into a well and killed him. So that's a pretty clear message to the Persians. No, we're not here to play game. This isn't something that's negotiable. So then he has to spend a couple years gathering up the second army to launch a second army. Now, launching a second army, you'll notice first thing he's got to do is stop at Naxos. Remember that this all started with Miletus trying to take Naxos and Naxos holding out. This is just infuriating for him. So when he gets to Naxos, once again, burns the city to the ground and slaves the population. Now he goes on conquering other islands along the way, and all the other islands that he comes across, he's very kind to, very beneficent, doesn't show him any cruelty or anything. Just says, give me the earth and water, okay, and we're good. And he carries on his merry way. He wants it to be very well known that as this army's coming, he's only out to punish those out to resist. If you don't resist, nothing bad is going to happen. You don't need to worry about his army ransacking your city if you submit. So, sending a very clear message, and gets all the way to Eretria. Remember, it was Eretria and Athens that resisted. Gets to Eretria and burns Eretria to the ground and slaves the entire population. That was the other one that resisted. And it's after that that he then turns his attention to Athens. Now, you might remember I told you that Athens had a tyranny that they had just overthrown and then established a democracy. The tyrant, Hippias, something like that, I can't remember his name right now. But the tyrant of Athens, when they kick him out, he's the one that goes to Persia, and he's with the Persians, leading them and helping guiding them. He's an Athenian citizen that's helping lead the Persian fleet, so he's helping them work out their logistics and tactics for conquering Athens. The idea being that, remember, when Persia conquers these cities, they put tyrants in place, because the Greeks are so hard to manage. So he goes to the Persians saying, go get Athens and I'll be your guy for the city. So he's trying to get back in power in Athens. So they actually have a local helping guide them, which is how they found Marathon. The reason that they're choosing Marathon is there's a plain right up the beach. If you can get off the beach, there's a nice plain. The big advantage that the Persians have on the Greeks, one of their big advantages is cavalry. So if you can get some nice open field, the cavalry can maneuver really well there. So he's bringing his army and lands it here at this beach at Marathon. Oh, I need to explain the Phalanx before I explain the actual battle. Well, he goes to Marathon, and then before we explain the battle, we'll explain the Greek actual fighting technique. So the Greek soldiers are called hoplites, and a hoplite has a big, massive shield and then a really long spear. And they get real tight formation where your shield overlaps the guy to your right and the guy to your left shield. So you go over one and under the other, which makes it pretty much an immovable wall. And then you have long spears with 3 lines of guys able to all attack at the same time. So if someone making a frontal attack on you, there's just no chance, basically. So that's the Phalanx formation. There's a picture of it. That's what it looks like, and you can see that that's pretty hard to charge into. Now that I'm looking at it, I think that's actually a Macedonian one, which they changed a little bit. They made the shield smaller and the spears longer. So that wouldn't have been the Greek one. The Greek one, only 3 could fight at a time. But same idea. Just imagine these guys, except for bigger shields, smaller spears. And that's a Greek Phalanx. The Macedonians just improved upon it. So this is what the Greek army is roughly going to look like on this beach at Marathon. So Marathon's up here, nice flat land. Here's the beach that they're on. Here's close up on the beach. And this is high ground. This other stuff is lower ground. So the Phalanx, the Greeks lined up and they pinned them down on the beach right up here with this big wall. And look at this picture for a second. So the red is the Persians, the blue is the Greeks. Over here is like a swampy land, and then the Persian fleet is right here. And it's tucked up right there to protect it against the ocean. So this is where the fleet needs to be safe. So that's why it's tucked way over here past the swampy land, and why the army's clear over here, not in the swampy land. So in case you're wondering why they don't just have their boats over here. And there is this 3-day standoff, like he said. The Persians waiting for a while the Greeks are also waiting. Greeks are holding out, waiting for the Spartans. So you'll remember that he said, first thing Athens does when they hear this army's coming, they send a messenger to Sparta saying, hey, the army's coming, send your troops. Sparta says, we will right as soon as this religious holiday's over, which takes, 7 days, 10 days?
Around there, yeah.
Something like that. So the Athenians are holding out, hoping that the Spartans will show up before the Persians actually attack. But what are the Persians holding out for? What are they waiting for? The reason that the Persians are holding out is because of Hippias, or whatever that tyrant's name is. I should have written it down somewhere. He was a powerful man in Athens. And they think, with the combination of a Persian army at the door and this, their previous leader here, in helping this army, the Athenians will naturally turn on themselves, overthrow anyone in their government resisting the Persian Empire, and that Persia can get all this without having to fight. So that's what the Persians are hoping for here. That's why they didn't instantly attack. Now, after a couple days, they come to the conclusion, okay, the Greeks, no Greeks are going to join us. We're just going to have to fight the battle to win this. Now, what they actually decide to do, I need a slightly different map. Well, it doesn't matter. I can just explain. What they decide to do, because the army that they had was 30 to 50,000 men, and the Greeks here have an army of 9 to 10,000 Athenians with an extra 1,000 Plataeans. That's a local city around here from Plataea. Anyways, since the Persians outnumber them so bad, they come up with this plan. They say, here's what we'll do. We'll split our army in two. We'll leave half our army here on the beach to fight them, and we'll load up the other half onto our fleet. We'll sail it around and go and attack Athens while their army is here. So that's the big plan. It's not a terrible plan. And so they start loading up their army, and they sail off. The Athenians realize they're in trouble because they actually told the women and children, if you see the Persians and we haven't come back, it means we lost, go ahead and kill yourself, so that you don't have to go into slavery. So there was like a mass suicide pact in Athens that if things go wrong, we know what to do because there is no mercy for coming from the Persians. They're out for blood. So when the army loads up, and as he said, they also took all the cavalry with them, and goes to sail off, they realize this is it. This is as good as things we got. We've got to attack now and turn around and head home. So they very rapidly and quickly just attack, charge down the hill. Now what they did is they thinned out this line of Greeks really, really thin to hold them, and then load up their men to have full phalanxes on the side to flank them. So these guys' whole job is just hold, don't let them pass you, while these guys come around and crush them from the sides. Now remember, the name of the game isn't you're slowly killing everyone, it's just get them to panic. And oftentimes, one of the reasons these flanking maneuvers are so powerful is because here you are fighting on this side and suddenly there's someone on your side now. That's going to cause you to panic. It's one of the reasons that flanking works so good. People start to panic when that happens. So when you've got them both coming from the sides and from the front, these guys start to panic. Now they didn't take all the ships. The Persians just took some of the ships and left with some of the army. They left some of the ships to keep track of some of the army. Anyways, they start to panic and they try running back to their ships. And he mentioned something about the archers. What happened is the Greeks acted so quick, the archers didn't have a chance to get a shot off. Here you were just waiting for so long, and suddenly the Greeks just charged out of nowhere. So it was very sudden that the battle started, which prevented the archers. They weren't in position, they weren't at all ready. Attack comes, they weren't able to even get a shot off. So it's a very sudden battle, and like he said, it's a massacre. So for the actual battle, there were 26,000 Persians, 600 warships, against the 10,000 Athenians roughly, maybe 11,000 Greeks if we want to talk about the Greeks. When it's all said and done, the Greeks lost 192 Athenians and 11 Plataeans for little over 200 casualties, but the Persians just get destroyed. Over 6,000 men lost in this battle. So absolutely destroyed in the battle. And like he said, they send the runner from Marathon back to Athens as quick as they can to just say the words, "We were victorious." That's it. Make sure that they know. So if they see the Persians, they don't think, "Oh, our army's defeated." So he booked it as fast as he can, and as the story goes, he gets there, he completely exhausts himself getting there as fast as he could, says the words, "We were victorious," and dies. And that's why he was in such a rush to get there, to stop anyone from killing themselves. Okay. And this army also needs to pick it up and hightail it to be over there in time for the Persians to meet the Persian army back at Athens. And from there on out, the Athenians, they go and they're able to return before the Persians get there. The Persians are mind blown. The army was on that beach. Now they're here. What happened to our army? So,
Hey, Don, I have a question.
go ahead.
How much does geography come into play in this for the Greeks?
Oh, it's huge. because Greek phalanx is one, very hard to maneuver. So it's pretty much only good at going straight forward, so you need flat land. So that is huge for the Greeks. They always want to fight on an open field. Two, they're very subject to a phalanx, since it's so hard to maneuver. It's very vulnerable on the sides. Remember, all your spears are pointed that way. So if they can come around the side and attack you, you're in trouble. So you notice that they stretched it far enough to reach both these rivers to make it pretty hard for the Persians to quickly get around them. So geography is actually huge in battles. And then three, fighting downhill is always a huge advantage as well. So they had that advantage as well. They were fighting down the beach while the other people had to fight up the beach. Because it's just, any of you running around a beach sand know how exhausting it is to try and go up in beach sand. You're just going to get exhausted. Much easier to go downhill.
But the whole Greek territory is pretty rugged, right?
It is very rugged.
Difficult.
So it's interesting that this is the fighting style that they develop. And since both of them use that tactic, then they often, when they're fighting each other, because Greeks are always fighting each other. In the midst of all this, all Greeks hate all other Greeks, are always fighting. But yeah, since they both use the same tactics, they're both willing to seek open fields. When you have the Romans coming to the rise to power, they have to fight the Samnites, which fight in mountainous areas. And when they first are coming to power, they use the Greek phalanx. But then they're fighting against these guys who use hit-and-run tactics. And these swarming and running away, they don't give you a fight in open battle. So the Romans had to abandon this tactic in that hilly terrain and develop a whole new system they call the maniple system. So yeah, it works with the Greeks because both of them are using it, but there's a lot of Greek ego, I guess you could call it, preventing them from innovating war in any way. So for a Greek, using something like a bow and an arrow means you're just a flat-out coward. You're not willing to face me man-to-man with your sword, your shield, my shield, let's fight it out. So it's very effective for the armies that they're going against at the time, but it ultimately becomes outdated. By the time the Romans come across the Greeks, it just doesn't hold up. Anything else? Okay, so that was the Battle of Marathon. Right there, there's the city of Athens. So they were selling the fleet around, only to be surprised when you see how the brown dotted line fades off. That's when they decide they're done and turn back, go home. So, yeah. Darius launches his attack, and it doesn't work out. So now he is absolutely furious with these Athens. His first attack, he wasn't even able to get there. They caused him tons of problems over here. Now he comes here and he got wrecked. So he's furious, and now he mobilizes Persia. They are now going to face the full wrath of the Persian Empire. This next army that he's going to come with, it's not going to be something that he scraps together in a couple years. He is going to call upon every corner of Persia, put together an absolutely elite army, and then come after these Greeks, and they are going to pay. Now, in the time between the Battle of Marathon and his second attack, Egypt also has a quick revolt and has to be reconquered. And so that also puts it off. So there's a 10-year gap between this first invasion and the second invasion. And let's go over what's going on in there. Talked about that. So that's how we're continuing. Okay, so in that 10-year time, there's a big question in Greece. Are the Persians actually going to come back? So Darius is absolutely planning on coming back. He immediately starts putting together an army. He dies in this 10-year gap. His son Xerxes then comes to power. Xerxes falling through with his father's plan, no change. A big army is absolutely coming. But the Greeks aren't sure that a big army is actually coming. It's not like you can call someone and say, hey, are they actually going to send an army? You just got to guess based off of what information you have available. So there's a big debate in Greece whether or not they're actually going to come back, because to them it's like you came and that was pretty embarrassing for you. Probably won't. So Athens, fortunately at this time, they discover a silver mine in Attica. And so they suddenly have access to a bunch of wealth. And one of the conversations is, what should we do with this wealth? And Themistocles is a man in Athens who is advocating that no, the Persians are going to come back. Furthermore, we need to build a fleet. We should put this money towards building a fleet. So that's ultimately what they end up doing with the money. The Athenians hit a silver mine, use a silver mine to construct a pretty powerful fleet, and that's how the Athenians end up preparing for this Persian invasion that's ultimately going to come. Now let's talk about the army that he puts together. So the army is coming. Xerxes does eventually invade, comes through the Hellespont. So I'll show you the path really quick that we're going to be following. He's following this path right here to come down. He's not going to sail across like they did before because of how massive his army is. He bridges the Hellespont. That's the gap of water here. The story goes that the first bridge he tried to build collapsed. He was so infuriated with it that he had the river whipped, or the body of water whipped 30 times or 300 times or something like that. A bunch of people out there just whipping the water for crossing him. But he's coming with an absolutely massive army. So Xerxes invades Greece in 480 BC. This is 10 years later, with what Herodotus says is 2.6 million military personnel and 1,207 ships. Now, most historians say that 2.6 million is off by a factor of 10. They think that what happened is a military unit that the Persians use only has 100 soldiers. Herodotus misunderstood, thinking it had 1,000 soldiers. So in counting those, he overcounted by a factor of 10. There's another very good reason to doubt that number. The Roman Empire at its height had less than 500,000 soldiers. So this idea that the Persians could fill 2.6 million men is a bit out there. But 260,000, that's a lot more believable. So that's most likely what the size was. And then with the ships, no reason to doubt him there. There wasn't military units that he would have miscounted. So it's most likely he just miscounted a certain grouping by a factor of 10. Anyways, give you another sense for the Spartans. So one of the Spartan kings, again, it's always the case in this, with these early Greeks. Anytime you get banned from your city, anytime you get exiled from your city, you run off and join the Persians. That's just the place that you go when you're in trouble in Greece. And so there's a Spartan king who he was exiled from Sparta, so he goes and he joins the Persians as you do. And once Xerxes finally puts together his army, he's so impressed with it, and Xerxes asks this exiled Spartan king if anyone would dare to oppose his army. Is he even going to have to fight, or is he going to be able to just march through Greece, just demonstrating how massive this army is, and everyone will just give in? And the Spartan king replies that Spartans will not, under any circumstances, accept terms which would mean slavery for Greece. And he goes on to explain, Spartans are far more afraid of their laws than any of your subjects are afraid of you. Now, the Spartan lifestyle that you come up is very strict, rigid, and the law is the law. Everyone follows the law. So he tries to explain to them that there's not a chance and that Sparta will fight you to the last man. So the fighting goes on, and the first fight happens here at Thermopylae, and I'll give you the Greek strategy for what they're going to do. So once Xerxes crosses the Hellespont, news gets back to the Greeks, and they know, okay, for sure he's coming, and we got to start devising a plan. So they come up with a loose alliance between a bunch of the city-states, a war council that they put together to start deciding how they're going to combat the Persians. And so they decide upon Thermopylae to hold the land army here, and then the Cape of Artemisium, I think it's how you say that, up here. So this is where they're going to hold off the fleet. This is where they're going to hold off the land army. And so they're going to hold them off on both fronts here, giving the rest of Greece time to mobilize and get ready for the ensuing battle. And so first we'll talk about what's going on at the Battle of Thermopylae, and then we'll talk about how the fleet's doing. So the Battle of Thermopylae, he went into pretty good detail with this one. So, maybe mention one more thing with this picture to keep something in mind. Remember, it's not all the Greeks fighting this battle. So there's a lot of people that aren't joining in on the battle. In particular, Thebes. This one's especially shameful because Thebes is seen as one of the big boys on the block. And the fact that Thebes isn't joining in this war is shocking to a lot of people, including the Thebans. So there's a lot of Thebans who are absolutely disgusted with the fact that their city isn't joining, and they end up joining Leonidas on his launch up to here, on his march. That's what I was looking for. On his march up here to Thermopylae, they're going to stay with him, and the Thebans actually stayed with the 300 Spartans who hold out all the way to the end. Once the 300 Spartans die, then they finally surrender, and it's only Thebans left when that happens. So they decide to stay the entire time. So there were people in the cities who were in support of the war effort, even if the city itself was. So Thebes says, nope, we're not joining. But there were Thebans who said, no, that's disgraceful. We're going to go join. Anyways, and then for reasons that you already mentioned, when they're going up with this army, they can't take the entire army. Religious holidays going on. So what Leonidas is able to do, remember they have to follow the law here, and they're also a very religious people, so you can't just break the law, and you can't just take an army and go fight during this religious holiday. That's against the rules. But it is not absurd for a king to take a guard of 300 men with him. So this is a king and his guard that are marching off to go hold the path at Thermopylae, and they gather up roughly a total of 7,000 Greeks to go and fight this battle. Now what they do, they build a small little wall here that they're going to fight with, and they didn't know about this pass here. They sent some men, they split their army, and they have a bunch of men watching this pass, but apparently when Xerxes sends his immortals around to flank him, those guys just run off. So it's not that they didn't know about the pass, it's not that they didn't plan for holding them in the pass, they thought that the pass would be really easy to hold, they had men there, and those men just instantly booked it as soon as any army came along. So that's why that back pass was open. So the Spartans are there, they hold them up. After 2 days, the Persians discover this pass and they start to go around. Once their army kind of booked it and they knew that the Persians were coming, then the Greeks knew that they were done for. Ooh. Probably weird. The Greeks knew that they were done for, and so 300 Spartans, along with some other Greeks, and particularly the Thebans, decide that they're going to stay here, hold off as long as they can to give the rest of the men a head start so that they can retreat and live to fight another day. And when it's all said and done, Greeks lose 4,000 men, Persians lose 20,000 men, so even though technically the Greeks lose this war, it's a huge morale victory for all of Greece. When the Greeks hear about the 300 Spartans, that becomes, they instantly become immortalized in the minds of the Greeks. That now becomes like a war cry for the Greeks from here on out. So this actually inspires all of Greece that, yes, this is a very winnable war, and we can actually hold these guys off. So the next battle, well, this battle's going on at the same time. And what's happening is the Greeks decide that they're going to hold off the Persian fleet over here to stop it from making any progress. The whole idea right now is just hold up the Persians so they can't get inside. Greeks at this time, they only used half their fleet. They had the other half of their fleet in reserve. So they have 271 of their ships going up against all the Persian ships. The Persians decide, okay, we'll keep men here to keep you pinned, and then we'll send 200 ships around to flank you. That was the Persian plan. Well, those 200 ships that they sent around ended up getting destroyed in a storm right here. So that ended up not happening. The Greeks, they each exchange blows. There isn't a decisive victory either way. Once the Greeks find out that Thermopylae's been passed, which is right there, they realize there's no point holding the Persian fleet here anymore. The army's already gone past, so they do a strategic retreat back to Athens. Oh, Athens. There's Athens on the map. So, strategic retreat back to Athens, and now the new war plan is to hold the Persians right here by Corinth. So, Persians got through, now they're going to be able to ransack most of Greece. The military of Greece ends up holding this little strait right here to stop them from getting to the Peloponnesus, that's the name of this part of the Greek peninsula. And then Athens takes the fleet, and they're going to hold them up right here near Salamis. So now the next plan is stop the Persian land army from getting past this point, stop the Persian ships from getting past this point. Now you might think, why don't the Persian ships just go around that point? The reason that they won't do that is because it's very dangerous to leave your back exposed like that. You could easily get your supplies cut off, communications cut off, there's a lot that could go wrong. So you can't leave an army behind you. So even though the Athenian fleet is just camping out, you can't really see it with that one. There's a better one. Here's the island of Salamis. Athens is over here. So the fleet is inside of here. That's where they're keeping it. The reason that the Persians can't just sail on is because then they have this fleet behind them that they're going to have to deal with. And so here's where the next fight's going to happen. Now, as soon as they get past Thermopylae, Athens evacuates, and they evacuate to this island Salamis, which is right next to them. Now, Persia, Xerxes, he's able to get through. He comes through ransacking all the cities that were opposed to him, in particular Athens, and he finally gets what he was after. He burns Athens to the ground. The entire city is completely destroyed. It's gone. There's no more Athens. And all the people are now just living on this island, which is a pretty desperate situation to be in. So, I mean, just comprehend that for a second. All the Athenians are now without homes, living on an island with nothing but a fleet to protect them. And it's a well-outnumbered fleet. That's the situation that they're in right now, because they resisted this Persian king. And he told you about most of this battle. So roughly the numbers, Greeks had 371 to 378 ships. The Persian has 600 to 800 ships. Now, two things to note about the Persian ships. They kind of had two types of vessels. One vessel was their smaller ships, which were meant to be very quick. Since they were meant to be very quick, they were light ships, not very heavy. The other ships that they had were like big ships for manning tons of archers to shoot arrows at you. In either case, both these types of ships are very susceptible to being rammed. So the way that the Greeks designed their ships, like you said, there's triremes. So, well, that's not really how it looks. It's more like this. So you have 3 rows of oars. That's just to give you a lot of force for it. But then on the front of your ship is just a big old honking piece of metal to ram into the other ships. So these ships are very heavy and relatively slow, but they made them a lot smaller than the Persian ships so that they're easy to navigate. They don't get stuck as easy. And then for the Persian little ships, they could just knock them over no problem. So all their most of their fleet is designed like this to be triremes, and their whole goal is you ram the ships. So the fleet is inside of here. That's where the Athenian fleet is. And the Persian fleet is out here. Now, the whole time that the Greeks are opposing the Persians, there is always tons of debate about what to do, what to do, what to do. It's not one decision after the other. There's always bickering, fighting, trying to determine what should be the best thing to do. And that was going on even when these ships were here. There were some people that still wanted to bail out and leave. There were some people that wanted to stay and fight, lots of split decisions. And so it was very well known to Xerxes that these people can't agree on anything. So when Democracies decides to send an informer to the Persians to say that, no, here's what their next plan is, they're going to try and retreat outside of this gulf, then he thinks, okay, I've actually got them. He thinks that they really can't come up with what they're going to do. And so that they set it up like everyone's now ready to go their separate ways. That's the way they set it up. And so he sends some of his fleet around here to make sure that none of them can escape, and then he gets ready to launch his attack. They feign a retreat, he goes in. Now, what helps sell it is the ships go off in 3 very separate directions in their 3 different groupings. And so it very much looks like, okay, these guys they've thrown in the towel. Persians go in, it was a bait, they got sucked in, they can't navigate their ships in here, they get them rammed, they get them destroyed, they end up panicking and leaving pretty quick. In fact, at the end of the battle, it was only the Ionian ships that were first forced to join the Persian fleet that were still fighting when they realized all the Persians had left, so the Ionians finally turned around and left. But this is the big defeat that puts an end to it. The Persians just lost the majority of their ships. This is the biggest victory of the war. This is the turning point of the war. From here on out, Athens is winning the war. Up to this point, I mean, Persia has just been marching through. I mean, they've been getting casualties, but they're superficial casualties compared to the resources that they have. And they had completely conquered half of Greece. They had all of Athens living on one island and everyone else hiding on the Peloponnesus. They had the mainland part of Greece. So this is the turning point. They lose a significant amount of their fleet. Greece only lost 40 ships. Persia lost 200 to 300 of their ships. And so now they're in trouble. They're in trouble because it's going to be difficult for them to form a formidable threat against the Greek fleet. Risking another attack, they could lose their entire fleet. And they also need to worry about supporting their mainland army using their fleet to support their mainland army with supplies here. So that's why it's such a big defeat for him. Xerxes ends up deciding to take his fleet and go home, loading up a bunch of his army, leaving a good portion of his army. So now it comes down to the last battle on mainland Greece. Persians probably have roughly 300,000. That can't be right.
I couldn't find an actual number for it either.
Yeah, that can't be right, but they definitely outnumbered the Greeks. And then remember, some people are actually supporting the Persians in this. It's not just all of Greece united against them. So they probably had roughly, so it could be 300,000. No, I said plus. Those numbers feel wrong. But suffice it to say, Persia well outnumbered the Greeks here at the Battle of Plataea. So it's called the Battle of Plataea because it's close to a town called Plataea. You see the rivers. Here's the Persian camp. This is the Persian line. Here's the Greeks. Now, this is high ground. This is lower ground. So Greeks are initially holding this position, end up moving to this position. Persians on the other side of this river, they've got a great position. Nobody wants to be the aggressor in this situation. So it's a bit of a standoff. The Greeks have it exactly how they want. They've got the Spartans over here. They'll be able to hold their own. They've got this flank protected by that stream, so that helps you from being flanked on that side. And then you're on high ground. That's lower ground. If they come after you, you can attack them. Well, what ends up happening is Persia gets kind of annoyed. They have some cavalry. They keep harassing the Greeks with the cavalry, and eventually their cavalry is able to cut off this stream so the Greeks can't get water. Once the Greeks can't get water, they're in trouble. And so what they decide to do is, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to retreat back to this position. And it's going to be a nice controlled retreat. They completely butcher this retreat, and there's a lot of miscommunication. So these guys end up going off that way. These guys end up going towards the city of Plataea, and these ones are the only ones doing what they're supposed to do. The retreat is so terrible that the Persians think that they're panicked and they're just fleeing from the battlefield. So the Persians charge into them. Now these guys are completely taken off guard that Persia's just going to charge it to them when they have this obviously superior position. They weren't panicked. They were still controlled. They just had a terrible retreat. So they're able to turn around and fight on the dime, basically. And so Persia basically sacrificed their vastly superior position. They're completely out of formation, charging what they think are retreating enemies that are running away, and they get annihilated. They get annihilated so fast, these guys are able to turn around and push the army back and beat them so fast, those guys panicked so fast, that the Persian camp didn't even have time to empty to start the battle. Because it happened that quick. When they realized this was happening, they sent the orders to just charge. Before the Persian camp could even completely empty out, they had come back, and then it was just manslaughter inside the camp. All of them stuck in there with Greeks coming out on every side. They were absolutely destroyed. Highly doubt there were any Persians left on Greek soil after this. So Persian losses, 50,000 to 250,000 men, whatever it was, while Greek losses are completely negligible. So just a huge blunder for the Persians. And on the same day, so the story goes, that they lose Marathon over here, there's a fleet battle going on over here. So the Athenian fleet, along with some, other cities, they put together a fleet to go finish off the Persian fleet. And the story goes on the same day, they have a big victory over here. It's not as famous of a battle, but... So in one day, the main portion of the Persian land army and their fleet were completely destroyed. Okay. So that gets us through the gist of it, and let's look at some of the aftermath of the Greco-Persian War. Well, this is still part of it. So what ends up happening? Okay, so the Persian armies were completely destroyed in mainland Greece. And once the Persians are destroyed in mainland Greece and driven out, and their fleet's been destroyed, so no chance of them coming back, the mainland army was destroyed. Then now there's all this bickering that's been going on the entire time. Becomes about whether or not they should continue attacking the Persians. So far, they just drove them out of mainland Greece. Now, some of the people want to continue driving the Persians out and freeing back all these Ionian city-states and re-obtaining the islands, helping them get their independence back. And others, in particular the Spartans, say, no, we took care of the immediate threat, we're done. And so this Greek alliance ends up kind of splitting. Half of them leave the alliance, say, no, we're done with the war. The other half join up with Athens now as the default leader to start this attack. Notice it's been Athens that got the two major victories of the Greco-Persian Wars. They won the battle at Marathon and they won the battle at Salamis. Those were the two major victories. And so now they're kind of viewed as the default leaders in this effort. So they start a second alliance called the Delian League to go on the offensive now and start reconquering Greek territories from Persia. Now, when they first start this league, all other city-states could join voluntarily. And what would happen is they would take their military forces, start freeing island after island, city after city, and then ask those cities if they want to join the league. And obviously, Athens just freed them. Of course, they want to join the league. So as they go along, these other cities start joining. These other city-states start joining this Delian League with the Athenians as the default leaders. Nothing's written in stone. But one of the deals are, if you're in this league, you need to make one of two contributions. You either need to contribute ships for a fleet or contribute money to pay for ships in a fleet. Those are your two options. Now, most of these city-states, as they're being liberated, they don't have any ships to provide, so they just start providing money to Athens. And Athens takes the money and builds a fleet. So what you have, as time's going on, you have tons of wealth coming into Athens, all these people as they're being liberated, paying these fees to Athens to support this fleet, while Athens personally is the one building up the fleet. And as time goes on, Athens becomes more and more powerful in this league to the point where they don't even allow you to leave the league. That no longer becomes an option. And there's one city that tries to leave, but they end up going to war with them and conquering them. So as they go back on the offensive and start freeing these people, Athens becomes more and more powerful. And as they become more and more powerful, these cities-states start to become somewhat subjugated to Athens. They're now paying dues to Athens, and Athens is the one with the big military, the big fleet, so they can go and beat anyone on the block. And this is the Athens of classical Athens, the Athens that has all the great architecture, the Athens of Pericles. Pericles is the main leader during this time. And it rebuilds a city. Remember, Athens was completely destroyed with all this money now coming in. They have these successful conquests, taking all this land back from Persia, all the yellow, coming under the Delian League. So with all that money coming in, it ends up becoming a really wealthy city. They're able to start paying for projects like the Parthenon and stuff like that. All that's happening at this time. So Athens becomes they become the powerful city-state at this time. And this is sometimes referred to actually as the Athenian Empire. These other cities become basically subject cities to Athens. Which, yeah, we'll see that produces the golden age for Athens. Okay, and that ends roughly the Greco-Persian Wars. Maybe say exactly how it ends. Athens kicks Persia up and down. They end up getting all this. What happens is they try going and getting Egypt from Persia. They fell there. After they fell there, they decide, okay, let's let things be. And that's when peace is finally decided. And that's the end of the Greco-Persian Wars. This is roughly what Athens' power looks like after the wars. And the entire series of wars was 50 years. And now we have a setup for what comes next as the Peloponnesian Wars. Obviously, a lot of city-states are going to take issue with what Athens is doing. And conflict goes on in Greece. But we'll cover the Peloponnesian Wars later. Any questions? All right. So 825, the Pluralist. We probably have time to do one. Okay, so now jumping our brains back into philosophy, let's think about the problem that we're stuck at right now. So the problem that we're stuck with is the problem posed by Parmenides versus Heraclitus. Parmenides says that everything is one, the all is one, change is an illusion, there's no such thing as change, and it seems to follow logically that this has to be the case, and yet change is a common fact of our day-to-day experiences. And so these pluralists, they're going to be trying to combine, I just lost his name. Heraclitus and Parmenides. They're going to be trying to combine Parmenides with the obvious fact of change over and over again and come up with an explanation for the world to do that. So we'll see the first attempt at this comes from Empedocles of Acragas. So Empedocles of Acragas, notice that he's born during the Greco-Persian Wars. They're already off in effect. They started in 499 BC. So he's living through them. But he's over in Italy, so not going to have a huge effect on him. Acragas is right there on Sicily. Anyways, Empedocles. He's going to be the first one. He's going to be the first what we call the pluralists. Why are we going to call them pluralists? They're going to say that the one stuff is many. So that's why we call them pluralists. We would have called, not Themistocles, Thales. We would have called Thales material monist, meaning the all is one, and the one stuff was water. The pluralists are going to say there isn't just the one stuff, but there is fundamental stuff. And it could be more than one thing. That's why they're called pluralists. Anyways, Empedocles now. So Empedocles, he's born an aristocrat, but seems to support the poor in his area, and seems to support this new government coming out called Democracy that Athens started. And the city, Acragas, in his lifetime transforms from a tyranny to an oligarchy. An oligarchy is where the wealthy are in power, a few wealthy people are in power, to a democracy, you know, a democracy. Now, for whatever reason, he seems to have been banished from his hometown, and so he spends the rest of his life just traveling around Greece, kind of like Xenophanes did. Student of Parmenides with Zeno, so he was contemporary with Zeno, and he was possibly most likely a Pythagorean too. We're going to see that he's the next closest thing to Pythagoras out of these pre-Socratics. He's going to be, he's got his philosophical side, but he's got his weird mystic side as well. He's going to say some interesting stuff. The same way that Aristotle called Zeno the father of dialectic, Aristotle calls Empedocles the father of rhetoric. Now, the reason he calls Zeno the father of dialectic is because, remember, Zeno finally is giving his arguments, and they're not these poetical arguments. He just had his arguments, his paradoxes. Well, Empedocles is going to go back to the poetic style of argument, but fortunately, he's the last one for a while, so we won't have to be reading a lot of weird poetry after him. Father of rhetoric, as opposed to dialectic, rhetoric is persuading someone rather than just giving an argument. So he's going to say that this was a very persuasive man. He knew how to win friends and influence people.
And does rhetoric have any correlation to rhetoric? Like rhetorical questions, stuff like that?
I'm sure. I don't know the roots of why it's called a rhetorical question.
How do you spell rhetorical?
Just like
I
that.
guess it's just like that.
AL.
So I gotta have the same root somehow. But rhetoric for Aristotle, he'd say it's composed of three parts. You have your, he says in rhetoric, there's, we'll get to rhetoric. He has a book called Rhetoric. We'll get to him with Aristotle. But anyways, so Empedocles, he's going to be a little bit weird like Zeno, or like Pythagoras, but instead of being a genius in mathematics, it's medicine that he seemed to be very gifted in. So he was a physician, said to have brought a dead woman back to life, and to have been able to reverse old age, and all sorts of strange things were attributed to him in what he was able to do medicine-wise. Now, he founded the Italian School of Medicine, so chances are he was actually a very skilled physician who just would use it to seem very impressive, seem a bit mystical.
Do we have any like sources or something for reversing old age, or like an explanation, or is that just something?
Just one of those stories. It was something he was said to do. Same way that someone broke into Pythagoras' house and decided not to steal anything because everything was so weird. Okay, so some of his notable achievements. He proved air was a physical substance. Now, air is sometimes associated with the void, and so people would argue there's no such thing. Air is not a physical thing, it's just our word for empty space, and they'd wave their hand like this, saying, obviously there's nothing there. Now, the way he proved this, it doesn't matter how he proved it, but it's very similar to, he essentially took a cup, tipped it upside down, stuck it in water, and then turned it over and watched the bubbles come out. And he said, you just watch the air come out. There was that volume of air in the cup. When I stuck it down in there, the volume of air is still in there. When I shifted it over, that physical air moved out, and then water moved in. If you just thought about that as void, why wouldn't water go in when you stuck it down there to begin with? So there must have been something already in it, namely air. So that's how he argued air was a physical thing. Now, I don't know why they didn't already think air was a physical thing, especially with like the blowing experiments. You can feel it. You move your hand fast enough, you can feel air. But that's what he's said to have done. Okay, this one's interesting. Believe that light took time to travel. I have no clue how he would have come to that conclusion, but that is very much the case. And then he also believed that the way that we see is we emit light from our eyes, as opposed to light entering our eyes. So that one's a little weird, especially with how his further theory of knowledge comes. But we'll see that later. He also believed that our bodies were full of pores, which they are, and that part of respiration occurred through the skin. And then this, we'll see how this is a major part of his theory for how we come to know things. So keep that one in mind. He wrote 2 major poems, the first one on nature, which is his philosophical one, and then his Purification, which is very Orphic, very much like Pythagoreanism. And so we'll go over both those. So first, his poem on nature. It was addressed to his pupil, Pausanias? Not sure how to say that. So his big claim. He is going to claim that everything is composed of 4 fundamental roots or elements, as opposed to there just being one stuff. So Thales said everything was water. By the time you get to Empedocles, he says, you know what, let's just say that there's fire, air, water, and earth, and there's 4 stuffs that make up everything, and then we'll be good. Now, with these 4 stuffs that compose everything, fire, water, earth, and air, that's just the physical substances that make up the universe. He also needs to explain motion in the universe. Just because I have earth sitting there, or water sitting there, how am I going to create motion with that? So he also needed a way to introduce motion, so he also introduces 2 forces that act on the elements. He calls them love and strife. Now, that's a bit poetical language, and obviously he's using a poem for this, but remember that the Greeks at this time, they very much knew about magnets, and they knew a little bit about charges. So they would have seen, and this is exactly how it is in physics. Physics, forces act 2 ways. There's attractive forces and repulsive forces. There's attractive forces and repulsive forces. If I have opposite charges, they attract each other. If I have the same charge, they repulse each other. So this notion that the forces, the way things move, seems to be this attraction and repulsion is very much the way it is. He's going to use poetical language to describe those, but that's what he ultimately means, and he's going to confuse the 2 ideas. We'll see where sometimes it seems to be a love attraction, other times it seems to be an attraction, like a positive and negative charge attract each other. So it's a bit ambiguous mixed in his poetry, but love and strife, those are his forces. And then he's still taking a purely materialist approach. He's going to try and explain everything through random physical interactions. So the same way that Thales was a material monist, tried to describe everything is really just the physical stuff, water, that's all it is. He thinks everything is just the physical stuff, these 4 elements. And he's going to try and describe everything with these 4 elements.
Was he the first one to have the 4 fundamental elements?
He is the first one to say there's 4 elements. People would loosely talk about the elements in reference to these things, but he's the first one to say they're fundamental, they're not combinations of each other. So if you were to ask Anaxagoras, for example, you'd say, take air, compress it enough, and you get water. Empedocles would say, no, all the water that's in existence is all the water that's in existence. It's all the elements out there that are water. And they always have been and always will be just those elements. So you don't have one element changing into each other. There's 4 stuffs out there, and they're water, fire, earth, and air, and they always have been and always will be those 4 elements. Now, to give you a taste of his poetry, for where he introduces these. Here first the 4 roots of all things: shining Zeus, life-bringing Hera, Adonis, all right, and Nestus, whose teardrops are well springs to mortals. So here's where he introduces the 4 gods representing the 4 elements. We think that Zeus represents fire, Hera represents earth, Hera represents air, Adonis represents earth, and Nestus represents water. She's the easiest one to see from what's up there. Whether he assigned the gods to those elements in that way or not isn't important. We know for sure that throughout the poem he's talking about earth, fire, water, and air, and he's using the gods to stand in for those sometimes, but not at other times. So that gives you a taste for the language. It's still not straightforward arguments. He's still not just coming out and saying it, but here's what the argument seems to be. So now we've got to deal with Parmenides. Remember, Parmenides says you can't have things coming into being and going away. So he says, okay, I can get around that. The roots themselves, fire, water, earth, and air, however much there is in the universe, is how it's always been and always will be. And those never come to be, and those never go away. There's always been those four elements. Now, what he's going to say here is that, so you might say, okay, but talk about something like a tree growing. He's going to say that wood is going to be a certain combination of earth, water, fire, and air. And that it's not really wood, it's just the right ratio. If you've got three earth, 2 water, an air, and a fire, that's what wood is produced out of. He's going to say it's this right combination of these 4 elements. And so even though it looks like wood, tastes like wood, smells like wood, it's really, if you didn't have such crude senses and could see it exactly as it was, it's really just this right combination of fire, water, earth, and air. So he's going to say nothing new came into being, nothing new passes away. It's just different combinations of these 4 elements that give rise to all the things we see. So remember that change is viewed as something coming into being and going out of existence. But Empedocles claims this is just an appearance due to changing combinations of the elements. So there's no contradiction. We never cheated. Nothing new really came into being. Nothing new really went out of existence. It was just combinations of the stuff that's always out there, and love and strife moving them around to change the combinations. Go ahead.
Who are Adonis and Nestes?
I'm guessing gods.
Just gods.
Yeah, I don't know the Greek pantheon that well. I just know the big names. You'd assume that those are some of the big names, but... Okay. So he has fire, water, earth, air as the 4 fundamental substances, but he's also going to assign them properties. Now he's the first one to separate properties as well from substances. He's going to say there isn't a physical thing wet. Wet is a property that things have. There isn't a physical thing hot, dry, cold. These are going to be properties that physical things have. So he's going to say air has a property of hot and wet. Water has a property of wet and cold. Earth has a property of cold and dry. Fire has a property of dry and hot. And so these are the qualities that we experience. Something feels wet, something feels dry, something feels cold. And he's going to say the way that we explain those things coming to being, the way we explain your experience of those things is they're fundamental properties of the elements. So this is how he's also going to introduce how you have certain sensations. Does that make sense so far?
Mm-hmm.
Now, for the life of me, I could not figure out how to make sense out of his putting blood here, yellow bile here, black bile here, and phlegm here. I kept getting this diagram, but I couldn't find an explanation for how those are supposed to have tied in. But somehow he ties in his view of medicine with these 4 elements. And then the elements, or the seasons, a lot easier to tie in. Once you decide that fire has to be summer, well, that kind of forces everything else to fall out. And then relates them with the 4 times of life, if you include death as a time of life. Childhood, maturity, old age, and decrepitude. Go ahead.
All this came from him, so the hot, wet, dry, cold, he professed all this?
Yes.
And decrepitude is death?
It's decrepit. And it's either really close to death or death. I assumed it's death. And decaying. Anyways, so 4 fundamental elements that make up the entire universe. And everything we see is just changing combinations of those different elements. Now, remember the Pythagoreans thought that disease was due to a lack of harmony in the body. He ties it specifically to a lack of harmony between the dry and the wet, or a lack of harmony between the hot and the cold in the body. So if you're really hot and have a fever, you must need cool to help restore balance to your body. Or if your mouth's really dry, I don't know, then you must need water and restore that balance. Anyways, and then this view of chemistry, this idea that we have these 4 fundamental elements that have these 4 fundamental properties, is kind of as far as chemistry goes for the next 2,000 years. This is going to be the standard model now for how we view the 4 elements. Which is why chances are, when I already said what are the 4 elements before you ever walked in here, you would have already named it to me. It's very much built into our culture. So that's why we're not going to get a lot of progress past this point for a long time until science kicks off. What were you going to say?
What about Lysippus and Democritus?
The atomic theory.
Yeah.
The atomic theory doesn't give us any push forward in the elements because they say there's a... The thing that you can say the atomic theory would add if you combine the two, because he's not viewing the fire as an atom. He wouldn't say you've got one indivisible piece of fire here.
Yeah.
So that's what the atomists are going to say is no, they're fundamentally composed of atoms. But the atomists also say that there's an infinite number of different types of atoms, so they don't have 4 fundamental types. You couldn't start making a periodic table of their atoms. You can start making a periodic table of these elements and talking about their properties. So the atomist view never really takes off in ancient times, and it's not until we have a more sophisticated view of atoms that it comes back thousands of years later. Drastically different theory than what was initially put forward.
Okay.
But when we get to, by the time Aristotle's talking about physics, he's going to talk about the 4 elements, fire, water, earth, air. Sometimes it make reference to a 5th element that the stars are composed of. But these 4 are kind of the standard view. Okay, so everything's made up out of these 4 elements, and then there's supposedly these 2 forces that give motion to these elements, love and strife. So love and strife give motion to the elements, where love is the attractive force and strife is the repulsive force. Love seems to be within the elements themselves, although that was hard to determine from the language, and is responsible for bringing them together. Love is responsible for generation. And then strife is responsible for separation, destruction, thereby creating the appearance of change. So remember, they describe all change in terms of generation and destruction. Whatever change you want to talk about, you can always talk about it as a generation of one thing and the destruction of another thing. And so once you explain generation and destruction, you've explained change. So he's going to say, all the generation you see, that's due to love. All the destruction you see, that's due to strife. You grow a plant, it's love that's bringing that flower together, bringing the elements in that flower together as it grows, 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 and then it starts to decay. And it's going to be strife that causes it to decay, and it slowly returns back to the ground, back to nothing. All the elements split off of it. No question? Now, it's also hard to determine whether or not he viewed love and strife as corporeal, but unclear how. So some people say that these were also physical things in his universe somehow. Other people say, no, not really, and it's hard to determine it from the language. But what is clear is his view of the universe, these forces of love and strife, wax and wane in turn. So as the universe evolves with time, then the overall love in the universe increases, increases, increases up to some maximal point, and strife decreases, increases, increases up to some minimum point, and then the process reverses, going back and forth in these cycles of love and strife, increasing and decreasing in turn. But they're never able to overcome each other due to some necessity or some sort of contract. This is the strangest part of his philosophy and the hardest thing to make sense of. But some contract, some necessity stops love from completely overcoming strife and stops strife from completely overcoming love. So to understand his metaphysics, there's 7 fundamental elements of it. There's fire, air, earth, water, what composes all the physical things that we see in our day-to-day lives. There's love and strife, responsible for generation and destruction. And then there's a contract which makes sure love never overtakes strife and strife never overtakes love. Make sense? All right, so let's get into his cosmology, because I think that ties how he views all this together. So he sees the universe as going through these cycles where love and strife wax and wane. So we'll pick somewhere to start. So in the beginning, we have the pure domain of love, or what he would call the time of harmony. And all the elements, we're going to say that they start here. So in this state, all the elements start out in a union, all mixed together into this big Parmenidean ball. This undifferentiated stuff of just being. You can't tell one part from another part because it's perfectly, fire, water, earth, and air perfectly distributed throughout it, contained with love, everything grouped together into this big sphere of just being. So that's one portion of the cycle of the universe. And then as time goes on, love decreases and strife increases. So as love decreases and strife increases, then their ability to stay together in just one big ball slowly decreases, and things start breaking off, and you start to get things moving, changing, different combinations of things coming together. So fire starts to break off, so you might have something that now has more fire in it than something else, and another thing that has more water in it than something else, And so you start getting different combinations. And that's going to keep on going until everything separates off with its own. So over here in the pure domain of strife, or the time of chaos, all the fire is with all of fire, all of earth is with all of earth, all of water is with all of water, and all of air is with all of air. All the elements completely separate off on their own. So the time of love, all the elements are perfectly mixed together in some undifferentiable mass. At the time of chaos, they are completely separated from each other, each in their own section. And then love starts taking over, and they start coming back together, mixing until they all perfectly come together, and the cycle goes on. So that's his cosmology, how the universe is cycling. Said that the elements that separate off. It's worth mentioning how they separate off in the sphere. So at this stage, it's one big Parmenidean sphere of stuff, but it's also spinning. That's important. Where the spinning comes from, I don't know, but that's how he explains it. So you got this big Parmenidean ball sphere of being, and it's spinning, and its strife is increasing, the elements start separating off. So the elements that separate off of the sphere, first fire and air, creating day and night. Now fire and air, remember that he views all of outer space being filled with air. He doesn't have a view of an atmosphere around the earth like we do. So you see the stars, that's fire, and then between the stars, that's air. So it's fire and air that separate off first, creating the heavens basically. Leaving earth and water at its center. The earth is around the water, and then I guess somehow the pressure of the earth trying to squeeze down squeezes out water. So all water is squeezed out from inside the earth, which you can see how you might think that with wells and stuff like that. And then fire and air are held off the earth due to the spinning of the cosmos, like water is held in a spinning bucket, is the analogy that Aristotle gives. So you've all had the experience, you've taken a bucket, you can spin it, and the water stays in the bucket as you spin it around. Now, it's weird that he would use that as his analogy, because the exact opposite of what he's saying here would happen. When you spin around in a bucket, the heavier stuff goes furthest outside, and the light stuff comes to the inside. He's doing the opposite, but such is his explanation. Any questions on his cosmology and how that cycling is working? Okay, so that was bright. So I found some slides that capture the 4 stages of the universe a little better in case it was in any way ambiguous. So the guy went through the effort of making a bunch of brown dots to represent earth, white dots to represent air, blue for water, red for fire. So this is stage 1 of the universe, the time when it's in perfect harmony. Everything's all together in this one undifferentiated stuff. Everything's perfectly distributed. No part of it is any different from the other part. Then, as strife starts to mix with things, it causes air to start clumping up with itself, earth, and other stuff. And so you start getting different combinations of stuff. And this is the stage he thought our cosmos is currently in. And it's only during these stages, changing from perfect love to perfect chaos and perfect chaos to perfect love, it's only in these stages that something like life can exist. We require the mixing and unmixing of stuff to live. Go ahead.
So do you know if he knows about, like, the Big Bang?
He doesn't know about the Big Bang. Now that isn't until last century that theory comes along. Anyways, so he thought that this is the stage that we are currently in. We're in the stage where love is decreasing in the universe and chaos is increasing in the universe. Part of his explanation for why he thinks we're in this stage is looking at his history. It seems like things were better in the past and things have gotten worse as time went on. Remember, the Greeks very much knew about the Bronze Age collapse, so that could help explain some of this. They knew that they must have once been great in their past, and then there's the tendency to idolize the past, and then there's also the fact that they viewed the Iliad and Odyssey as actual history with great men, great demigods. So they see the earth getting worse as time goes on, or at least Empedocles does. And so it makes sense that love is decreasing in the universe and strife is increasing. But that's the stage that he thinks it's at. Then the stage of perfect strife is when all the elements are completely separated off from each other. And then we get back into the mix when strife is increasing, or love is increasing in the universe and strife is increasing. And during that period, once again, there can be life in the universe. So he only allows for life at certain times. Now, his view on how life comes to be is a form of evolution, but a pretty fantastic one. So we'll just go through it. So he says all this stuff is randomly bouncing around, coming to be, passing away. Eventually, this random perfect combination produces an eyeball. And eventually, this random combination produces an arm, and a leg, and a toe, and a cow ear, and a horn, and a pig's nose. And all the different combinations of all the different plants and animals that you see out there, eventually those come together. And then those separate pieces start randomly joining together. So 6 arms joined together and started running around as 6 arms like a weird looking spider thing. And 2 backs came together with 4 legs and 2 heads and 4 eyes. And all sorts of crazy creatures existed with all sorts of different limbs coming out in all sorts of different ways. And also mixing of animals. You would have had a man with the head of a bull, like the Minotaur that he knew about. So all these things are randomly coming to being and passing away until we got the stuff that we have today. Now, why did all these things cease to be? He says because they basically couldn't survive their environment. Only those combinations of things that were able to adapt to their environment, not instantly die off and reproduce, were able to continue on living. So, similar to evolution, but a very fantastic view in how life came to be. Only those combinations which were adapt to living survived, with the rest dying off eventually. So that's why we only have the stable life forms that we have today. Now, his theory of knowledge. This one's very interesting. So here I am, I'm this person composed of these 4 elements, and strife and love are randomly increasing and decreasing all around me with all the different elements. Anyways, the strife is definitely going to make so that elements in me are kicking off every now and then. I'm constantly just eroding. Now, there might be love also causing me to generate in some way, but I'm also in a state of constant erosion. Everything is constantly eroding. Stuff is randomly just coming off of you, the different elements. So, as things erode, they give off their elements. The elements then within us are able to pick up on this erosion. So, Jeremy's over there eroding, and he's giving off some fire, for example. I have fire within me. Some of that eroding fire coming off of Jeremy goes inside of me, and fire knows fire, like knows like. I'm able to pick up on that fire coming out of Jeremy, which enables me to see him, or hear him, if it's talking in the different elements. So he makes this whole theory of perception come down to somehow absorbing the elements coming off of you as you erode in some way. So the elements within us are able to pick up on this erosion, and thereby perceive the things eroding, like is known by like. The fire in me knows the fire that's eroding, the earth in me knows the earth that's eroding, etc. By perceiving things, we are able to learn about them, and by focusing, we are able to retain this knowledge. Okay, so he has a really weird view where I pick up on the elements eroding from Jeremy, and I've got them in my mind, and somehow, as long as I keep myself focused, it's like keeping those elements trapped in me. But if I allow myself to get distracted, and I lose my focus, then they'll get out of me. And once those elements drift back out of me, I lose that knowledge. So you've got to stay focused to retain the elements, and the knowledge is somehow embedded in the elements. Does that make sense?
Sounds like thought.
It's a very weird perception of knowledge. Like somehow that physical thing has within it the knowledge, and by that fire joining with my fire, I now know about the fire. So, and yeah, his notion of focusing is a very strange one. You gotta stay focused, otherwise the elements get out of you. And then, for whatever reasons, he thought our ability to think somehow resides in the blood, and that thought originates in the heart. I'm not sure why he thought that, just that he thought that. I would guess it was something along the lines of, once that erosion got inside of you, maybe since the blood's going everywhere, it's what helps communicate all those little bits of you all over my body to help me know. I don't know.
Or once your heart stops, your blood stops. You don't have any more thought.
Yeah, that's true. Could have noticed something along the lines of, someone bleeds enough, they pass out.
He was a physician.
Yeah, he was a physician. But how much he knew.
You see blood and hearts, and when they stop, so does your brain. It's a pretty direct correlation.
See, but he didn't put a lot of value on the brain. It was a while before value was put on the brain, because I think even with Aristotle, the brain is viewed as a mechanism for heating the blood.
For us, but I mean, he would just know the heart has stopped, the blood is stopping.
Yeah. Yeah, and the heart's always been associated with life, so maybe that's all there is to it. So that ends his, the philosophy part of his, well, that ends his philosophy. Any questions about any of his philosophy before we move on to his more mystical elements? So ultimately, he thought fire, water, earth, and air. Nothing's coming to being or passing away because there's always just these four elements. Anytime it looks like something's coming to being or passing away, it's just the different combinations of these four elements. And that's all that's really happening. That's his way of getting around Parmenides. Nothing new is really coming to being. Nothing new is really passing away. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay, now we'll get into his stranger thoughts. So he has a second work called On Purification. This he addresses to the citizens of Acragas, the ones that ultimately kicked him out. We have far less fragments from this poem than we have of the On Nature one, but he's going to make some pretty dramatic claims. One of the things he's going to claim here is that he is immortal. He thinks he's actually a god. We'll get his explanation there. But a little bit of a story about his death that ties to this. So he lived on Sicily, and there's a volcano on Sicily called Etna. And apparently, he wanted people to believe that he was an actual immortal, so rather than dying, the story is that he leapt into the volcano Etna so that there would be no body for anyone to discover, so he was hoping that people would think that he just ascended to the heavens with the gods. Now, as the story goes, he wore very particular golden sandals that anyone could identify, and that in the process of jumping, a sandal came off, and so that is how someone was able to figure out that he leapt into Etna. And some author took the time to compose a poem about it, and it goes, "Great Empedocles, that ardent soul, jumped into Etna and was roasted whole." Alright, so on purification, give you the opening line to give you a sense of how much he thinks about himself. Friends, I inhabit the great town looking down at the yellow rock of Acragas. I go about among you, an immortal god, no mortal now, honored among all as is meet, crowned with fillets and flowery garlands. Straightway, whenever I enter with these in my train, the people following him, both men and women, into the flourishing towns, is reverence stun me. They go after me in countless throngs, asking of me what is the way to gain, some desiring oracles, while some, being mere mortals, is essentially what he says there, beg to hear from me the word of healing. But why do I harp on these things, as if it were any great matter that I should surpass mortals, mortal, perishable men? So, gives you a sense of how he thinks about himself, and the poem goes on like that. Well, give you the heart of what the poem says. So he still has his metaphysics from before, and he's going to utilize that here to talk a little bit about ethics as well. So he associates the good with love and evil with strife, naturally enough. Since we are in the stage where strife, or evil, is increasing in the world, then we must have previously been in a golden age where there was more love or good in the world. Now, he expounds upon his view of metempsychosis, with many similarities to the Pythagoreans. He views all living things as being on an equal spiritual plane, so it doesn't matter whether you're a man, animal, plant, any living thing, they're all spiritually equal because it's going to be all the same souls recycling through. Now, he thought of humans as divine spirits condemned to wander this earth for past crimes done in a past life. And the best that I could piece together of what these might have been were eating animals. He's very much a vegetarian. Remember that the Pythagoreans were vegetarians, so it might have been nothing worse than in a past life you ate animals. And so since you did that, you are now cursed to go through 10,000 reincarnations on this earth as punishment. But there's hope. You don't necessarily have to go through all 10,000 reincarnations. You can also undergo a patholesis. A patholesis basically becoming divine, achieve a divine state, and break the cycle of reincarnations. Now, the story is that he had thought that he had achieved this state, broke the cycles of reincarnations, so now he didn't have to go through these reincarnations anymore, and so now he is a god. And so some people rationalize that the reason that he jumped into Etna is because he thought, since he broke the cycle of reincarnations, once he finishes this life, he's done, and he's going to go be a god now, so he's ready to go. And then you'll see that his view of God, he talks about, I was a little ambiguous in my language before. When we talk about all of us being gods, it's more like heroes in the sense that the Greeks use it, not the God. So there's going to be the God, and then there's going to be the fact that you can achieve a godlike state, an immortal state. So then he talks about on God, the one God. And he talks about it basically the exact same way that Xenophanes talked about God. For he is not furnished with a human head on his body, 2 branches do not sprout from his shoulders, he has no feet, no swift knees, nor hairy parts, but he is only a sacred and unutterable mind flashing through the whole world with rapid thoughts. So, one great big mind, I guess, that is the entire universe. Now, since a God is not a physical being, we cannot come to know God the same way we come to know nature. Remember that the way that I come to know about the world around me is I absorb the erosion coming off of those things, and that's how I get a knowledge of all of you in this room. Well, God isn't a physical being, and so now that one's not going to work. So how do you come to know God? Well, that's through the mystic rites and everything that they have in their Orphic religion. So the religion gives you the pieces on how you come to know God, and that's not very philosophical. But that's his justification for why you also need his Orphic religion. And then possibly that Empedocles also associates God with the sphere from stage 1. His language is very ambiguous, hard to know exactly if that's what he was saying. He talks about the God as though the God wasn't a physical thing, and then other times he talks about like it was the being in the beginning. So it's the exact same thing that Xenophanes did. If you remember Xenophanes, he talked about the God as this unmovable, changeless one, everywhere present, knowing everything. But then he made him coextensive with the universe, and everything is God. Physically, everything is God. And so it was really hard to make sense of what Xenophanes was saying. Empedocles seems to do the same thing. Aristotle gets annoyed with him and says he uses poetical language to disguise the fact that he has nothing to say. So Aristotle didn't think much of him. But that's Empedocles. His greatest contribution: fire, water, earth, air, the fundamental elements, and then love and strife with some sort of contract to stop one from overtaking the other. Any questions on Empedocles, the first of the Pluralists? Okay. Probably a good place to call it. So we'll end on Empedocles, and next time I think we should be able to get through Anaxagoras and the Atomists, for those of you who want to look ahead. Any questions? We don't need to do any sort of review. Okay. Those of you who want credit, let's stay and talk. The rest of you, we'll see you next week. And looks like